What if I told you that the strongest nation on the planet was just told no by the country next door, and instead of softening its stance, that neighbor quietly redirected $850 billion in energy flows toward the opposite side of the globe? The most astonishing part is that none of this had to happen. The turmoil now rippling across North America's energy system didn't start with empty storage tanks. It didn't begin with a ruptured pipeline, a regulatory collapse, or a brutal cold snap. It started with something far more corrosive and far harder to repair. It started with the gradual breakdown of the one element that keeps alliances intact. That element is trust. And when that trust finally snapped, it did not do so softly. It fractured in 4 words that will echo through global energy markets for decades. But before we get to those words, before we trace the diplomatic break that set off an $850 billion redirection of Canadian energy away from the United States and toward Europe and Asia, you need to see the foundation. Without that foundation, the headlines feel like political theater. With it, this becomes something far larger. A pivot in how power is distributed, how resources are allocated, and how nations decide who deserves long-term economic partnership. For years across administrations of both parties, Americans were told a reassuring story about energy. The United States, powered by shale, hydraulic fracturing, and horizontal drilling, had either reached or was on the cusp of total energy independence. Foreign suppliers no longer held meaningful leverage. America produced what it consumed, and anything extra was simply exported. That narrative was always incomplete. And the space between that narrative and physical reality is exactly where this crisis took root. Yes, U.S. oil and gas output surged over the past 2 decades. Yes, exports expanded. But coherence requires candor, and candor was scarce. Here is what officially occurred, stripped of spin. Facing tightening domestic supply pressures, particularly in industrial states, relying on affordable gas, administration publicly pushed for accelerated access to Canadian reserves. The language invoked partnership and continental security. It sounded reasonable at first glance. Beneath the surface, however, the tone conveyed expectation. It presumed compliance, not because the proposal was uniquely attractive or balanced, but because refusal was assumed to be implausible. Geography, it was implied, guaranteed acquiescence. Canada's role in that framing was to function as a reserve available upon request. The response from Canadian leadership crystallized in 4 words. Not for sale, Donald. No embellishment. No diplomatic cushioning. Just a direct statement of sovereignty that reverberated across energy markets and political capitals. Within hours, those words circled the globe. They appeared in European editorials and Asian policy briefings. They symbolized more than Canadian autonomy. They reflected a broader recalibration among middle powers and evolution from quiet accommodation to public boundary setting. Within days, Canadian officials were in Brussels, Berlin, Tokyo, and Seoul. These were not symbolic visits. Preliminary agreements were drafted. Feasibility studies for expanded LNG terminals on both coasts accelerated. Regulatory alignment with European standards advanced. The groundwork for an $850 billion redirection of exports began to solidify. Some diversification had been underway already. Canada had been exploring alternative markets quietly for years, but this moment accelerated the timeline dramatically. It signaled that the United States was no longer the automatic destination for Canadian energy.